Imagine a boy from a small Greek town whose father died when he was just a child. He had no family fortune, no political power, and no homeland that truly claimed him. And yet, his ideas would shape how humans think for over 2,000 years. This is Aristotle, the orphan who became the teacher of kings and the father of Western thought. Before we drift off into the story, leave a like and comment where you are listening from so others can find their way here too. Now let us journey back to ancient Greece to discover how one curious mind changed everything. The story of Aristotle begins in a small town on the northern edge of the Greek world. In the year 384 BC, in a place called Stagyra, a boy was born who would one day be called simply the Philosopher. Stagyra was not a great city like Athens or Sparta. It was a modest coastal settlement in the region of Macedonia, perched on a hillside overlooking the Aegean Sea. The town was Greek in language and culture, but it sat on the border of a kingdom that many Greeks considered half barbarian. This peripheral birthplace would shape the course of Aristotle's entire life. He would always be an outsider, a man caught between worlds, never fully belonging to any single place. His father was a man named Nicomachus. He was not a farmer or a merchant. He was a physician, and not just any physician. Nicomachus served as the personal doctor to King Amyntas III of Macedonia, the grandfather of Alexander the Great. This was a position of considerable trust and responsibility. In the ancient world, a royal physician had access to the inner circles of power. He was a confidant who knew the secrets of the court. Young Aristotle grew up in this atmosphere, spending his earliest years in and around the Macedonian royal palace at Pella. He would have seen the workings of power up close. He would have watched his father examine patients, mix medicines, and consult ancient medical texts. The profession of medicine in ancient Greece was not what we think of today. There were no hospitals, no medical schools in the modern sense, and no regulations. A physician learned his trade through apprenticeship, often from his own father. Medical knowledge was passed down within families like a closely guarded secret. The young Aristotle would have been trained from an early age in the basics of his father's craft. He would have learned the names of herbs and their healing properties. He would have watched as wounds were cleaned and bones were set. He would have been taught to observe the colour of a patient's skin, the rhythm of their breathing, and the quality of their pulse. This childhood left a deep mark on Aristotle's mind. From his father, he inherited a love of observation and a belief in the importance of physical evidence. Greek medicine at this time was not based on magic or superstition. It was rooted in careful observation of the body and its symptoms. Doctors kept detailed records. They looked for patterns. They tried to understand the natural causes of disease. This way of thinking, this emphasis on looking at the world and recording what you see, became the very foundation of Aristotle's philosophy. He would become the greatest observer the ancient world had ever known. But this happy childhood was cut tragically short. When Aristotle was still a young boy, perhaps around 10 years old, both of his parents died. The ancient sources do not tell us the cause of their deaths. Perhaps it was one of the many plagues that swept through the ancient world. Perhaps it was something else entirely. Whatever the reason, Aristotle was left an orphan. He was taken in by a man named Proxenus, who was married to his older sister. Proxenus became his guardian and raised him through his teenage years. We know almost nothing about these years of Aristotle's life. They are a blank space in the historical record. But we can imagine a thoughtful and serious young man, already showing signs of the brilliant mind that would later astonish the world. It was Proxenus who would eventually make the decision that changed the course of history. When Aristotle was 17 years old, his guardian sent him away from Macedonia to seek an education in the greatest city of the Greek world. This was not an unusual thing for wealthy families to do. Athens had become the intellectual centre of Greece. Any young man with ambition and talent would naturally want to study there. But for Aristotle, the journey was more than just the pursuit of education. It was the beginning of a lifelong quest to understand the nature of reality itself. That city was Athens. In the year 367 BC, the young orphan from the provinces arrived in the most glittering and intellectually vibrant city on earth. Athens was past the peak of its military and political power. The great wars against Sparta had weakened it, but its cultural and intellectual reputation was higher than ever. It was the city of the Parthenon, of the great tragedies of democracy. And most importantly for the young Aristotle, it was the city of the philosophers. Athens had become the undisputed capital of Greek thought. Students and thinkers from all over the Mediterranean world travelled there to learn and debate. The city that Aristotle encountered was a place of constant conversation. In the agora, the central marketplace, citizens gathered to argue about politics, law, and the latest ideas. In private homes, wealthy patrons hosted symposiums where guests reclined on couches, drank wine mixed with water, and discussed philosophy deep into the night. On street corners, self-appointed teachers called sophists offered lessons in rhetoric and argument to anyone who could pay their fees. The air itself seemed charged with intellectual energy. For a curious young man from the provinces, it must have been overwhelming and exhilarating in equal measure. The reason for this intellectual dominance was one man. His name was Plato. He was then in his early 60s, the most famous philosopher alive, a living legend. Decades earlier, Plato had been a student of the great Socrates, who had been executed by the Athenian state for corrupting the youth. After his teacher's death, Plato had travelled widely. He had visited Egypt and Italy. He had studied mathematics and mysticism. Then he had returned to Athens and founded a school. He called it the Academy, named after a grove of trees sacred to the hero Academos, where it was located. The Academy was not like a modern university. It was more like an informal community of scholars and students who gathered to discuss and debate the deepest questions of existence. The grounds of the Academy were beautiful and peaceful. Plane trees provided shade from the hot Athenian sun. Pathways wound between gardens and small buildings. There was a gymnasium where students could exercise their bodies as well as their minds. Statues of the Muses and other gods reminded visitors that learning was a sacred activity. In this serene setting, Plato and his students would walk and talk for hours, exploring questions that humans had never systematically addressed before. What is justice? What is the good life? What is the nature of reality? What can we truly know? It was to this academy that the 17-year-old Aristotle came seeking knowledge. We can imagine him walking through the city gates for the first time, his eyes wide at the temples and statues, the bustling agora, and the crowds of citizens and foreigners. He found his way to the grove outside the city walls where the academy was located. And there he enrolled as a student. He would remain at the academy for the next 20 years of his life. It was the most formative period of his intellectual development. He arrived as a provincial teenager. He would leave as one of the greatest thinkers in the history of the world. Plato's philosophy was a grand and beautiful system. At its heart was the theory of forms or ideas. Plato believed that the physical world we see around us is not the true reality. It is only a shadow, a dim reflection of a higher and more perfect world. In this higher realm exist the perfect forms of everything. There is a perfect form of a horse, of a tree, of justice, of beauty. The horses and trees we see on earth are just imperfect copies of these eternal and unchanging ideals. For Plato, the goal of philosophy was to turn away from the deceptive world of the senses and use reason to contemplate these perfect forms. True knowledge was knowledge of the abstract and the eternal, not the messy and changeable physical world. Plato illustrated this idea with his famous allegory of the cave. Imagine, he said, prisoners chained in an underground cave, facing a blank wall. Behind them is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, puppeteers move objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners, having never seen anything else, believe these shadows are the only reality. If one prisoner were freed and forced to turn around, he would at first be blinded by the fire. But eventually, he would see the real objects casting the shadows. If he climbed out of the cave and saw the sun, he would finally understand the source of all light and truth. For Plato, philosophers are like that freed prisoner. They have turned away from the shadows of the physical world to contemplate the true reality of the forms. The young Aristotle absorbed this teaching. He was a brilliant student. Later stories described him as the mind of the school and the reader, suggesting he spent long hours with books and scrolls. He had a reputation for elegant dress and fine speech, quite different from the simple, rough appearance that was common among philosophers. Plato himself is said to have nicknamed him the foal, perhaps because of his energetic and sometimes headstrong nature. Some said it was because a foal kicks at the mare that nourished it, a reference to the way Aristotle would eventually challenge his teacher's ideas. The academy was not a place of passive learning. Students were expected to participate actively in discussions and debates. They practiced dialectic, a method of philosophical argument that Plato had inherited from Socrates. In dialectic, two speakers would take opposing positions on a question and try to expose the weaknesses in each other's arguments. Through this process of question and answer, challenge and response, the truth was supposed to emerge. Aristotle became a master of this technique. He developed a sharp and precise mind, capable of dissecting any argument and finding its flaws. But even as he learned, a different way of thinking was beginning to stir within him. Aristotle had inherited his father's love of observation, his respect for the physical world and its details. Slowly, over the years, he began to question his teacher's grand system. He began to wonder if the answers to the deepest questions might be found not by turning away from the physical world, but by looking more closely at it. Where Plato saw the physical world as a distraction, Aristotle saw it as a source of endless fascination. Where Plato sought to escape to a realm of pure ideas, Aristotle wanted to understand the world exactly as it is. This growing disagreement was not a bitter fight. It was a respectful, intellectual divergence. Aristotle himself later wrote, "Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is truth." He loved and admired his teacher, but he could not accept ideas simply because of who taught them. He had to follow the evidence and his own reasoning wherever they led. While Plato looked up to the heavens for perfect forms, Aristotle began to look down at the earth. He became fascinated by animals, plants, rocks, and the mechanics of motion. He started to develop a new philosophy, one grounded not in abstract ideals but in the concrete reality of the world around him. This period of intellectual growth came to an abrupt end. In the year 347 BC, Plato died at the age of around 80. The leadership of the academy passed not to Aristotle, but to Plato's nephew, a man named Speusippus. The reasons for this are debated by historians. Some believe Aristotle's divergent views had made him unpopular with some factions. Others point to a simpler explanation. Aristotle was not an Athenian citizen. He was a foreigner, a metic. He could not own property in Athens and had limited legal rights. Placing a non-citizen at the head of the academy may have been seen as inappropriate. Whatever the reason, Aristotle left Athens. His departure may also have been motivated by politics. Anti-Macedonian sentiment was growing in Athens. The kingdom in the north, once seen as a backwater, was becoming a serious threat to Greek freedom under its aggressive new king, Philip II. As someone with deep connections to the Macedonian court, Aristotle may have felt unwelcome or even unsafe. He sailed across the Aegean Sea and settled in a town called Assos on the coast of Asia Minor in what is now Turkey. The ruler of this small territory was a man named Hermias, a former student at the academy, who had become a local tyrant. Hermias welcomed the famous philosopher and gave him a place to work and think. It was here in Assos that Aristotle entered a new phase of his life. He was now in his late 30s, free from the shadow of Plato, able to develop his own ideas. And it was here that he fell in love. Hermias had an adopted daughter, or perhaps a niece named Pythias. Aristotle married her. The ancient sources suggest it was a genuine love match, not just a political arrangement. They would have one child together, a daughter also named Pythias. Tragically, his wife would die young, only a few years later. Aristotle never forgot her. In his will, written decades later, he asked to be buried beside her. After her death, Aristotle formed a relationship with another woman named Herpilis. She may have been a servant or a freed slave. Together they had a son named Nicomachus, named after Aristotle's own father. During his time in Assos and the nearby island of Lesbos, Aristotle embarked on a great project of scientific research. He threw himself into the study of biology with an energy and systematic rigour that the world had never seen. The coastline and lagoons of Lesbos were rich with marine life. Aristotle waded into the water, collected specimens and dissected them with his own hands. He examined fish, octopuses, sea urchins, and shellfish. He cut them open to study their internal organs. He observed their behaviour, their feeding habits, and their methods of reproduction. He compiled his findings into a series of books that would become the foundation of the science of zoology. He worked with a methodical intensity that amazed those around him. He developed a system of classification, grouping animals by their common characteristics. He distinguished between animals with blood and animals without blood. categories that roughly correspond to our modern division between vertebrates and invertebrates. He identified the difference between live birth and egg-laying. He noted which animals nursed their young with milk and which did not. He was creating a framework for understanding the vast diversity of living things, a framework that would endure for centuries. His most famous work from this period is called The History of Animals. In this book, Aristotle described over 500 different species with remarkable accuracy. He noted that dolphins are not fish but air-breathing creatures that give live birth. He correctly identified that some sharks give birth to live young, while others lay eggs. He described the social behaviour of bees and the nesting habits of birds. He observed that the octopus changes colour, and that the cuttlefish squirts ink to escape predators. He noted that the elephant has a remarkably long pregnancy, and that the hyena has unusual anatomical features. Many of these observations would not be confirmed again for over 2,000 years. He did not just describe what animals looked like, he tried to understand how they lived. He studied their diets, their mating habits, and their methods of caring for their young. He noticed patterns in animal behaviour and tried to explain them in terms of the animal's needs and environment. He was performing real scientific work, based on evidence, in an age that had no microscopes, no laboratories, and no scientific method as we know it. He was inventing that method as he went. His approach of careful observation, systematic classification, and theoretical explanation became the model for all future biological science. This peaceful period of research was interrupted by a summons that would change not only his life, but the history of the world. In the year 343 BC, a message arrived from Macedonia. King Philip II requested that Aristotle return to his homeland. The reason was a matter of the highest importance. Philip wanted Aristotle to become the personal tutor to his son and heir. That son was a 13-year-old boy named Alexander. The orphan from Stagyra was being asked to educate the future conqueror of the world. Aristotle accepted the invitation. He travelled back to Macedonia and took up residence at a place called Mysa, a quiet rural retreat away from the intrigues of the royal court. For the next 3 years, perhaps the most extraordinary tutorial in history took place. Aristotle taught Alexander literature, philosophy, medicine, and science. He is said to have prepared a special edition of Homer's Iliad for the young prince. Alexander treasured this book for the rest of his life, carrying it with him on all his campaigns and sleeping with it under his pillow. He considered Achilles, the great hero of the Iliad, to be his role model and ancestor. We can imagine the lessons taking place in a shaded garden or a cool stone building. The young prince, restless and full of energy, asking questions about everything. The philosopher, patient and precise, guiding his student through the complexities of Greek thought. They discussed the nature of courage and honour. They debated the best form of government. They examined maps and talked about geography. They studied the stars and pondered the structure of the cosmos. Aristotle opened Alexander's mind to the vast world of Greek learning, planting seeds that would later bear strange and unexpected fruit. What did Aristotle teach the future conqueror? We can only speculate, but the influence seems clear. Alexander grew up with a deep love of Greek culture and a belief in its superiority. He also developed a restless intellectual curiosity that mirrored his teachers. On his campaigns across Asia, Alexander sent back strange plants, animals, and reports of foreign lands to Aristotle. He brought scientists and scholars with his army to record everything they saw. The Great Expedition was not just a military campaign, it was also a voyage of discovery, fueled in part by the spirit of inquiry that Aristotle had instilled in the young king. But the relationship between teacher and student did not remain warm forever. As Alexander's conquests expanded and he began adopting Persian customs and proclaiming himself a god, a rift opened between them. Aristotle believed in the natural superiority of Greeks over other peoples, an idea Alexander came to reject as he built his multicultural empire. Alexander began to see himself not as a Greek king, but as a universal monarch, the ruler of all peoples. He married Persian princesses and encouraged his soldiers to do the same. He demanded that his subjects prostrate themselves before him in the Persian manner, a practice that Greeks found deeply offensive. The final break may have come when Alexander executed Aristotle's nephew, Callisthenes, who had accompanied the army as its official historian, but had objected to the king's growing arrogance. Callisthenes refused to prostrate himself before Alexander and publicly criticised the new customs. He was arrested on charges of conspiracy and died in captivity. Whether Aristotle blamed Alexander for his nephew's death, we do not know, but the two men seem to have become estranged in the final years of Alexander's life. The student had outgrown the teacher, and their paths had diverged beyond reconciliation. Before this estrangement, however, Aristotle had already moved on to the final and greatest chapter of his career. In 335 BC, when Aristotle was around 49 years old, he returned to Athens. The political situation had changed. Philip had conquered Greece, and after his assassination, Alexander was now king. Macedonian power was supreme. Aristotle was no longer an unwelcome foreigner. He was a man with powerful connections. He used this new security to found his own school. He could not buy land because he was still a foreigner, so he rented a complex of buildings in a grove sacred to Apollo Lyceus on the eastern outskirts of Athens. His school became known as the Lyceum. It was also called the peripartos, meaning the walkway, because Aristotle had a habit of walking up and down a covered colonnade while lecturing to his students. From this word, his followers became known as the peripatetics, the walkers. For the next 12 years, Aristotle walked and talked and thought, producing an astonishing volume of work that covered almost every subject imaginable. The Lyceum was organised differently from Plato's academy. Where the academy focused primarily on mathematics and abstract philosophy, the Lyceum emphasised empirical research. Aristotle and his students collected specimens, gathered data, and conducted observations. They created a library that rivaled any in the ancient world. They assembled a museum of natural specimens where students could examine plants, animals, and minerals from across the known world. There may even have been a small zoo where living animals were kept for study. It was the closest thing to a modern research university that the ancient world ever produced. The range of Aristotle's interests was almost superhuman. He wrote on logic, creating a system of formal reasoning called the syllogism that remained the basis of Western logic for over 2,000 years. A syllogism is a form of argument with two premises and a conclusion. For example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This might seem obvious to us now, but Aristotle was the first to analyse such arguments systematically. He identified the valid forms of syllogistic reasoning and showed how invalid arguments could be detected. His logical works, collected in a book called the Organon, became the foundation of education throughout the medieval period. He wrote on physics, developing theories about motion, change, and the nature of the cosmos. For Aristotle, the universe was divided into two realms. The sublunary realm, everything below the moon, was a place of change and imperfection. Here, things were made of four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Each element had a natural place. Earth was heaviest and sank to the centre. Fire was lightest and rose to the top. Objects moved naturally toward their proper place. The celestial realm, the stars and planets, was different. It was perfect and eternal, made of a fifth element called ether. The heavenly bodies moved in perfect circles, carried on crystalline spheres. This cosmic picture, beautiful and orderly, would dominate Western thought until Copernicus and Galileo overthrew it in the 16th and 17th centuries. He wrote on biology, classifying living things into a hierarchy from plants to animals to humans. He developed the concept of the scala naturae, the ladder of nature, in which all living things could be arranged in a continuous series from the simplest to the most complex. Plants were at the bottom, possessing only the power of nutrition and growth. Animals added the powers of sensation and movement. Humans alone possessed reason, the highest of all faculties. This way of organising nature, with humans at the top of a natural hierarchy, had profound implications for how later thinkers understood the place of humanity in the world. He wrote on ethics, asking how a person should live to achieve happiness. For Aristotle, the goal of human life is eudaimonia, a Greek word often translated as happiness, but which really means something closer to flourishing or well-being. Humans flourish by fulfilling their unique function, the thing that makes them different from all other creatures. That unique function is reason. Therefore, the happy life is the life of rational activity, a life spent thinking, learning, and making good choices. His main ethical work, the Nicomachean Ethics, was named after his son Nicomachus, who may have edited it after his father's death. But Aristotle was not a cold rationalist. He understood that humans are social creatures with emotions and desires. Virtue, for him, was not about suppressing your emotions, it was about training them. A virtuous person is one who has developed good habits so that doing the right thing feels natural and even pleasant. He taught that virtue lies in a mean between two extremes. Courage, for example, is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and wasteful extravagance. By practicing these virtues, a person develops a good character, and a good character leads to a flourishing life. He also emphasized the importance of friendship. For Aristotle, a good life is impossible without friends, but not all friendships are equal. There are friendships of utility, where people are friends because they are useful to each other. There are friendships of pleasure, where people are friends because they enjoy each other's company. And there are friendships of virtue, the highest kind, where people are friends because they admire each other's character and want to help each other become better. Such friendships are rare and precious, but they are essential to the good life. He also wrote extensively about politics. For Aristotle, humans are by nature political animals. We are not meant to live alone like gods or beasts. We need the community of the city-state, the polis, to achieve our full potential. A good city provides the conditions for its citizens to live virtuous lives. He studied the constitutions of over 150 different Greek city-states, analysing their strengths and weaknesses. His students helped him gather this information, travelling to different cities and collecting copies of their laws. The resulting work, The Politics, is one of the most important texts in the history of political thought. He identified three basic types of government: rule by one person, which is monarchy when good and tyranny when bad; rule by a few, which is aristocracy when good and oligarchy when bad; and rule by the many, which is a polity when good and democracy when bad. He believed the best practical form of government was a mixed constitution that combined elements of all three, balancing the interests of the rich and the poor. He also emphasized the importance of the middle class, arguing that a state dominated by either the very rich or the very poor would be unstable. He wrote on art and literature, creating the first systematic analysis of tragedy in his famous work called The Poetics. For Aristotle, tragedy has a specific function. It arouses the emotions of pity and fear in the audience, and then purges those emotions through the experience of the drama. This purging he called catharsis. A good tragedy tells the story of a noble person who falls from happiness to misery, not because of wickedness, but because of some error or flaw. The greatest tragedies, like Sophocles' Oedipus the King, show us how even the best people can be destroyed by fate and circumstance. By watching their suffering, we learn something about the fragility of human happiness. He wrote on metaphysics, asking about the fundamental nature of reality itself. This work, called simply Metaphysics, meaning after physics, because it was placed after his physics books in the ancient editions, explored questions that still occupy philosophers today. What does it mean for something to exist? What makes a thing what it is? Is there an ultimate explanation for why anything exists at all? Aristotle proposed that there must be an unmoved mover, an eternal and perfect being that is the ultimate cause of all motion and change in the universe. This concept would later be adapted by Christian, Jewish, and Islamic thinkers as a philosophical argument for the existence of God. He wrote on the soul, arguing that the soul is not a separate substance trapped in the body, but the form of the body itself. The soul is what makes a living thing alive. Different kinds of living things have different kinds of souls. Plants have nutritive souls, giving them the powers of growth and reproduction. Animals have sensitive souls, adding the powers of sensation and movement. Humans have rational souls, adding the power of thought. When the body dies, the soul ceases to exist. There is no separate immortal soul that survives death. This view put Aristotle at odds with both Plato, who believed in the immortality of the soul, and later religious thinkers who found his view troubling. He wrote on the weather, dreams, memory, rhetoric, and dozens of other topics. His method was always the same. First, he would gather all the existing opinions and observations on a subject. He would consult the writings of earlier thinkers and collect the common sense views of ordinary people. Then he would analyse these opinions, looking for contradictions and problems. Finally, he would propose his own solution, one that tried to preserve what was true in the earlier views while correcting their errors. He He called this method saving the appearances. It was a way of building knowledge systematically, brick by brick, rather than starting from scratch with abstract principles like Plato. At the heart of Aristotle's philosophy was a new understanding of the world. He rejected Plato's theory of separate, eternal forms. For Aristotle, the form of a thing is not separate from it, existing in some heavenly realm. The form is in the thing itself. A horse has its horseness not because it participates in a perfect heavenly horse, but because the form of a horse is embedded in its physical body. The physical world is not a shadow to be escaped. It is the only reality there is. To understand reality, you must study the physical world in all its messy, changing detail. This led Aristotle to a profound interest in change and motion. How do things change? Why do they change? He developed a famous theory of 4 causes to explain every change in the world. The material cause is what something is made of, like the bronze of a statue. The formal cause is its shape or structure, the design of the statue. The efficient cause is the agent that brings it about, the sculptor who carves it. And the final cause is the purpose or goal, the reason the statue was made. For Aristotle, everything in nature has a purpose. Acorns grow into oak trees because that is their natural goal, their telos. Eyes exist for seeing, or rainfall so that crops can grow. This idea that nature is full of purpose is called teleology, and it was central to Aristotle's worldview. The years at the Lyceum were the most productive of Aristotle's life. He gathered a community of students and researchers around him. They worked on collaborative projects, pooling their observations and analyses. Aristotle himself lectured in the mornings to his advanced students on difficult philosophical topics. These were called his esoteric or internal works. In the afternoons, he gave public lectures on rhetoric and popular philosophy to anyone who wanted to attend. These were called his exoteric or external works. The exoteric works were polished and literary, written in dialogue form like Plato's. They were praised in antiquity for their beautiful prose. Sadly, all of these have been lost. The works of Aristotle that survive today are almost all from the esoteric lectures. They are not polished books intended for publication. They are more like lecture notes, dense and sometimes difficult to follow. They were likely edited and compiled by his students after his death. What we have is the core of his technical philosophy, stripped of all elegance. Even so, the sheer intellectual power shines through. This period of intense activity came to a sudden end in 323 BC. In June of that year, Alexander the Great died in Babylon at the age of 32. The news sent shockwaves through the Greek world. With Alexander gone, the Macedonian Empire began to fragment, and in Athens, long resentful of Macedonian domination, anti-Macedonian sentiment exploded. Aristotle, with his known connections to the Macedonian royal house, was now in danger. He was charged with impiety, the same charge that had been used to execute Socrates decades before. The specific accusation related to a hymn Aristotle had written for his friend Hermias, the ruler who had welcomed him in Assos. Hermias had been captured by the Persians and tortured to death. Aristotle had composed a poem in his memory. His enemies now claimed this poem was inappropriately religious, treating a mere mortal with honours due only to the gods. The charge was flimsy, but in the heated political atmosphere of Athens, it was dangerous. Aristotle did not wait to face trial. He knew the charge was politically motivated. He is reported to have said that he would not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy. He fled the city and went to Chalcis, a town on the island of Euboea, where his mother had owned property and where he had family connections. It was a quiet retreat, far from the turmoil of Athens, but his health was failing. He had been working himself hard for decades. The stress of the flight and the loss of his school must have been devastating. Within a year of his arrival in Chalcis in 322 BC, Aristotle died. He was 62 years old. The cause of his death is unknown. Some ancient sources say it was a stomach ailment. Others offer more fanciful stories. One legend, almost certainly false, claims that he drowned himself in the waters of the Euripus, a strait known for its strange and unpredictable currents, frustrated that he could not explain them. This is surely a myth, but it captures something of Aristotle's spirit, the relentless drive to understand, the refusal to accept mystery. His will has survived. It is a remarkably human document. He asked for his wife Pythias' bones to be placed in his grave, as she had requested. He made generous provisions for his slaves, ordering that some be freed and that none should be sold. He provided for the education of his children and the care of his household. He asked his friends to look after his son Nicomachus and his daughter. He left statues to be dedicated to the gods in gratitude for his good fortune. It is the will of a kind and thoughtful man, not a cold intellectual removed from human concerns. After his death, the Lyceum continued under the leadership of his successor, Theophrastus. Aristotle's works were preserved by his students, though their history over the following centuries was complicated. The lecture notes were supposedly stored in a cellar for generations, where they were damaged by moisture and insects. They were eventually brought to Rome, edited and published in the 1st century BC. It is these edited texts that form the basis of the Aristotelian corpus we have today. The influence of Aristotle on Western civilization is almost impossible to overstate. For nearly 2,000 years he was simply called the Philosopher, as if no other thinker even came close. His logic was the basis of education throughout the medieval period. His physics and cosmology, though eventually replaced by modern science, dominated European thought for over a millennium. His ethics shaped the moral philosophy of Thomas Aquinas and the entire tradition of Catholic thought. His political ideas influenced the development of constitutional government. His poetics still provides the framework for how we analyse drama and literature. The Islamic world preserved and transmitted his works during the European Dark Ages. Arab philosophers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes wrote extensive commentaries on his texts, treating him with almost religious reverence. They called him the first teacher, meaning the first of all philosophers. When his works were rediscovered in Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, it sparked an intellectual revolution. The great medieval universities were built around the study of Aristotle. To be educated meant, above all, to know your Aristotle. Of course, Aristotle was not right about everything. His physics was eventually overturned by Galileo and Newton. His biology contained many errors, alongside its brilliant observations. His views on women and slavery were typical of his time and are rightly condemned today. He believed that some people were natural slaves, suited by their nature to serve others. He believed that women were inferior to men in their rational capacities. These ideas remind us that even the greatest thinkers are products of their time and place. But it would be unfair to judge Aristotle only by his errors. His true achievement was something greater than any single theory. He invented the very idea of systematic inquiry. Before Aristotle, philosophy was often a matter of inspired insight and bold speculation. After Aristotle, it became a disciplined study with clear methods and standards of evidence. He showed that knowledge could be organised, that the world could be divided into subjects, that each subject had its own appropriate methods, and that patient observation and careful reasoning could unlock the secrets of nature. He was not just a philosopher in the narrow modern sense. He was a scientist, a biologist, a political theorist, a literary critic, and a logician all in one. He was perhaps the last person in history who could claim to have mastered all the knowledge of his time. After him, the world grew too complex, fields of study multiplied and specialised. No single mind could contain it all. But for one brief moment, in the mind of one remarkable man, all of human knowledge was unified. The legacy of Aristotle is not a set of doctrines to be memorised. It is a way of approaching the world. It is the belief that the universe is rational and understandable. It is the confidence that careful observation and clear thinking can reveal the truth. It is the conviction that knowledge is not just for its own sake, but for the sake of living well. These ideas are so deeply embedded in our culture that we often forget where they came from. They are the invisible foundation on which Western thought was built. To walk through the ruins of ancient Athens today is to walk in the footsteps of Aristotle. The grove where the Lyceum once stood is now a public park. Archaeologists have uncovered the foundations of the buildings where he taught. Visitors can stand where his students once gathered to hear him lecture. The physical traces are faint, but the intellectual legacy is everywhere. Every time we make a logical argument, every time we classify a plant or animal, every time we ask what makes a good life or a just society, we are following paths that Aristotle first cleared. He began as an orphan from a provincial town. He ended as the greatest intellect of the ancient world. His life was marked by loss and exile, by wandering and uncertainty. He never had a true home. Athens treated him as a foreigner. Macedonia remembered him as a native son who had left. Even his relationship with his most famous student, Alexander, ended in estrangement. Yet through all this, he never stopped thinking, never stopped observing, never stopped teaching. In the end, Aristotle's life tells us something important about the nature of intellectual achievement. It does not require wealth, or power, or noble birth. It requires only a curious mind and the courage to follow ideas wherever they lead. The boy who dissected fish on the shores of Lesbos had no idea that his notes would be read for millennia. The teacher who walked in the garden of the Lyceum did not know that his words would shape empires. He simply wanted to understand. And in that simple desire, he changed the world. The armies of Alexander conquered the known world. The wealth of great empires has crumbled to dust. But the influence of Aristotle runs deeper than conquest and endures longer than gold. It is woven into the very fabric of how we think. Every question we ask, every category we use, every argument we make carries within it the fingerprints of the curious orphan from Stagyra. His body lies buried somewhere near the ancient town of Chalcis. But his mind, his restless and brilliant mind, lives on in every student who has ever wondered how the world works and set out to find the answer. The philosopher is gone, but philosophy remains. And as long as humans seek to understand themselves and the universe they inhabit, the spirit of Aristotle will never truly die.